Welcome to Worth Your Time with your hosts from the nationally syndicated Bob and Tom Show, Kristi Lee, and the president and CEO of the Indianapolis Zoo, Dr. Rob Shumaker. Our mission to inform, entertain, and educate with guests from all aspects of life. We guarantee there isn't another podcast that features two hosts with such different backgrounds and discussions with remarkable people doing exceptional things. So let's get started. Here are your hosts, Kristi Lee and Dr. Rob Shumaker.
Kristi, we are back. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm really good.
It's the second part of our wonderful discussion with
Dr. Allen Dugatkin. Lee is an evolutionary biologist in the Department of Biology at the University of Louisville. If you did not listen to the first segment, please do that.
Yeah.
It is fantastic. And we talk about a whole number of things, but focus on Lee's new book titled The Well-Connected Animal, subtitled Social Networks and the Wondrous Complexity of Animal Societies. It is a great book. I encourage you to read it, and I know you're going to enjoy the conversation. Lee, thanks for being back with us.
My pleasure.
Hey, Lee, at the end of our last conversation, you gave us a tremendous description of the macaque monkeys on Cayo Santiago Island off of Puerto Rico, and you were talking about the complexity of female social networks, and we asked you to stop mid-description and pick it up for this episode because you were talking about Hurricane Maria and what that did to these monkeys living on that island. Can you explain how that impacted those couple thousand monkeys that were living on this island?
Absolutely. And just as a kind of quick refresher, basically, on the island, there are about 1,500, 2,000 monkeys, and people had been studying their social networks in females, and it really mattered if you had a lot of friends who were picking parasites off you. It made you live longer, and it mattered how many friends you had and how many friends of friends you had in terms of how many babies you produced. And so this is where things were sitting. And then 2017, Hurricane Maria hits, and it's been a while, so we might have forgotten how devastating a storm this was. And the eye of the storm essentially was over Puerto Rico, which means it was also Cayo Santiago is just a 5-10 minute ferry ride away. So Hurricane Maria strikes, and it absolutely devastates the island. 2/3 of the vegetation on the island is just wiped away. A lot of the resources that the people who were studying the monkeys, and again, just a sort of stepping back, reminding folks, there are no humans who live on this island. It's just the monkeys. Humans come in on a ferry, they go out on a ferry every day. The setup that the animal behaviorists had, a lot of that was wiped out, had to be rebuilt. But initially, the people who studied the macaques, they didn't have anybody on the ground seeing what was happening because Maria was just devastating. You weren't going out on a ferry to look in the middle of Maria. And so they were terrified. They were really worried about the animals. They thought all 1,700 of them are dead. They just didn't know. Eventually, they were able to get some people over there, and it turns out, and this is something that yet exactly how this happened, they don't know. But essentially, none of the monkeys were killed, even though 2/3 of the vegetation on the island was wiped out. They don't know exactly where the monkeys were hiding or how they pulled this off, but they were all there, okay? And in time, the animal behaviorists got this study going again. And after they calmed down, and after the researchers calmed down and they realized, okay, the monkeys are safe, we can start doing our studies again, we can look at these social networks, they realized, wait a minute, we have an opportunity here to do something that has almost never been done before. People had been studying social networks for a while, but nobody really had a good example of what happens to social networks when a devastating natural catastrophe happens. How does it affect the social networks? How do the social networks respond to that sort of devastation? And now, all of a sudden, all the monkeys are there. We can start studying their social networks again, and we can try and answer that question. How do they respond to these catastrophes? This has implications for response to catastrophes in other primates, maybe even humans. So here's what they found. And this was in many ways surprising. Anything they would have found would have been surprising because nobody really knew anything about the response of networks to devastation like this. One thing that they thought was maybe what the animals will do is that these grooming networks where they're basically pulling parasites off each other, maybe you'll just groom your friends more as a kind of release of stress and a bonding, social bonding kind of thing. Turns out that wasn't what happened. They did not increase the strength of their friendship with any particular one of their friends. What they did do was develop more friendships. And so essentially what they did was they deepened their position in the network, this grooming network, by having more friends than they did before. Again, grooming does more than just get parasites off your body. We know that what it does is things like lower your stress hormone levels. And you can imagine what the stress hormone levels of these monkeys must have been shortly after Hurricane Maria. Now, one of the other things we talked about in the first part of our interview was that in social networks, it's not just who your friends are, but how many friends your friends have. And in the monkeys, after they went through this devastation, and the researchers knew one of the things that they did was basically increase the number of friends they had. It turns out, right, that the way that they did this was fascinating. What they found was that if macaque 1 was friends with macaque 2 before the hurricane, and after the hurricane, macaque 1 now has more friends, okay? Mm. Who are those new friends? They're likely to be friends of macaque 2, their original friend. So they're adding in new friends that are friends of their friends. And that's who their new friends are, right? And so it's friends of friends. And this is what they did in response to devastation. They formed more friendships, and they formed more friends of friendships. Now, what all of that translates into in terms of their survival, Lauren Brent, who's leading this team, and others are still working on that. But the very fact that their networks were completely restructured, all of a sudden you have tons more friends, and you have tons more friends of friends, and your friends really matter. And all of these things are going on all in response to a hurricane.
Did mating increase as well? Did people come back like humans do? And, we were so depressed and scared, and now there's a lot of babies?
Yes, certainly. It didn't take long for that to happen. And Hurricane Maria came, and I doubt that they even lost one bout, like one round of reproduction. Wow. So they've been producing babies. And I'm sure that one of the things that Lauren and her team are looking at is, if you responded by having more friends or more friends of friends, did that translate into having more babies or surviving longer? I'm sure these are the things that they're looking at right now.
So one of the things I really enjoyed when reading this book is how you focused on social networks in different domains. For example, purely social behavior in macaques. I love how you broke it down into things like the food network and how your social network impacts food and nutrition and so on. Now, you teased us about it in the first episode. Please, can you talk about vampire bats?
Yes.
It's one of the best, to me, it was one of the best sections in your book.
But thank you. And so I'm happy to. This is another just incredible and also fun system to talk about. So again, I think a little background for the listeners on vampire bats will make all of this make more sense. Okay. Most mammals don't fly, and bats are mammals, and they fly. And flying requires a tremendous amount of energy compared to walking. So if a vampire, and we know from Dracula and other things that we've heard, that vampire bats feed on blood. And that's true. They do. It's not on human blood, but they clamp on to domesticated cows and that sort of thing, and they suck their blood. Now, if a vampire bat doesn't get a new blood meal about every other day, it can starve to death, right? Getting that blood meal is much more critical in a flying mammal than it is in other mammals. So back even in the 1980s, an incredible animal behaviorist by the name of Jerry Wilkinson began studying these blood meals in the vampire bats. And if you don't get a meal every other day, and you might die, and often you don't get a meal every other day. And so what do the vampire bats do? So what Jerry did was he was filming what these bats were doing. They live in essentially carved out dead trees, and he would stick his head underneath and film up. The vampire bats had these little rings on their feet, so he knew who was who, colored rings on their feet, and he knew who was who. To make a long story short, this part of it anyway, what Jerry found was that if a vampire bat is starving, if it's near that 2-day point where it doesn't have enough food, it's in serious trouble. What it will often do is, if another vampire bat comes back to the roost and has had a blood meal, and you can tell that because their bellies are super extended. No, if a bat has other food, and by you, I mean a bat in that roost who's starving will know if another bat who came back just had food, because their gut will be bursting out. What they'll do is they'll do this kind of stereotypical behavior, very ritualized behavior, where they essentially are licking the other bat. And what they're trying to do is to get this bat who has a tummy full of blood to stick its mouth in your mouth and regurgitate some of that blood to you. And
this is the greatest story ever, by the way.
How often does that work?
Okay, great question. How often does it work? If you want to know if a vampire bat who's got this belly is going to do this and regurgitate food, then what you need to know is if when they were hungry, the bat who's now begging them gave them food. So they keep track of who helped them when they were starving.
This is fantastic.
They're much more likely to help somebody who helped them. So you have this reciprocity, right? You help those who help you. Okay, so Jerry does this phenomenal work, and this work again is done like in the late 1980s, early 90s. One of the first studies where people had shown this kind of tit for tat behavior, where if I help you, you help me. Now, fast forward to about 15 years ago, and a fellow by the name, two people actually, Simon Rippiger and Gerald Carter, were working on vampire bats. People have been studying them ever since Jerry's work. And so one of the things that people really didn't know was, first of all, is this more than a one-on-one thing? Are there social networks in terms of blood sharing? In other words, if I help you and you help somebody else, am I more likely to help that other person, that other bat? And the kind of networky stuff that we were talking about with the macaques, except instead of grooming in the macaques, we're talking about giving blood. It turns out there is a very complicated social network of blood sharing going on inside bat roosts. And Simon particularly demonstrated that network was in place. So it wasn't just a kind of one-on-one thing. It was these rippling effects throughout a group. What's more, there was also a network of grooming, because they also groom each other like the macaques. And the grooming network and the blood sharing network were super similar, which makes sense because these are both kind of friendly-ish behaviors. So he demonstrates this, and he demonstrates this first in a very sort of controlled experimental way. Now, that's cool that we know that there are social networks in the bats. What people did not know was this. When the bats go off and look for a cow to clamp onto, nobody really knew what went on then, because bats, they're fast and they travel a long distance, and no one had really been keeping track of what they do outside of in their little roost. The question then became, do those social networks inside a carved out tree, do they translate into something when the bats go out and they actually are looking for blood and looking for animals to clamp onto and suck blood from? So what Simon did, and this is actually now very common in social network work, and it's actually technologically, it's beautiful. What they now have are these little transponders that they clip onto they put it on the back of a bat, and they put receivers all out through the fields where the bats might go and find a cow, and they know where the bats are going when they go out. And what's more, these little battery packs that the bats have on their back, it not only tells the researchers where they are, but the little battery packs actually talk to each other. That is, if two bats meet and they both have these little battery packs on, the battery packs know that there's another bat and they know who it is. Okay? So now what they find is this, that when you're looking at situations in which there is more than one bat sucking blood from a cow, it turns out that if you want to know if bat one is there and you want to know what bat is also likely there, the answer is it's a bat that was deeply tied to the first bat by these blood-sharing networks inside the roost. So what they're doing inside the roost is translating into them hanging out and feeding together when they're clamped on to the cows. What's more, it turns out in these social network experiments, I'm giving you this kind of overview of what goes on. The studies are really complicated because when you're dealing with complex behaviors like this, a lot of times there were alternative explanations that you have to examine to make sure that it really is a social network and it's not something else. They were interested in was like, if they're feeding on the bat together, how did that happen? Did they leave the roost together? Did they come back to the roost together? Or do they somehow meet up when they're out and then join together? And it turns out, and this was surprising in some ways, that if a pair of bats is on a cow, the odds are they did not leave the roost together. And the odds are they will not fly back to the roost together. That somehow they are coming together out in the field and doing this. How? They're still trying to figure out, but there are hints. These bats give off ultrasonic calls that we can't hear, but they can. And some of them are often given in friendly, pro-social situations. And the thought is that these bats are picking up on those signals when they're out looking for a cow. And that's why you have individuals who are in this blood-sharing network joining together after they've left and they're out flying around, that somehow they're picking up on these calls that they're giving one another, and they're hanging out with their friends who share blood with them in the roost. And now you're going to get the blood together with them on the cattle.
It's incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible.
And look, I'm just going to pivot and say bats are some of the most incredible animals ever.
Love them.
It's one of those groups of animals, they need all the friends they can get. And so when I hear stories like this, I just hope people appreciate these are remarkable, incredible, complex animals. What great work.
I have a bat house. Everybody should have a bat house.
Fantastic.
All that stuff is a little
They are wonderful. They are wonderful creatures, and even above their social complexity, we should do everything we can to help them. Absolutely.
Hey, wait, did you call it guava?
Whatever. What is it called? Guano. I was close. I'm not a scientist.
Guava's a fruit.
And guano is the poop. Got it. Okay, we're going to pivot from bats to my favorite animal. And you didn't know this, Dr. Lee, but my favorite animal is a dolphin. Always has been, always will be, even though I have become very much in love with chimpanzees recently. Part of the book, you talk about dolphins helping fishermen. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is a great example because in many ways it's unique. And what makes it unique is that we'll talk about these dolphin social networks in 1 second that are integrally involved with human social networks. Most of the time, these examples that we're talking about, we're focused on the animal social network. Here, their network interacts with ours. And so basically, here's the story. On the coast of Brazil, a researcher by the name of Simon Simeo Lopez has been studying a bunch of populations of dolphins that do something that almost no other animal does, which is they cooperate with humans in terms of getting their food and in terms of us getting our food. So what happens is this, and it's only in 9 populations that have at tops a couple of hundred dolphins where this happens, and nowhere else in dolphins and almost nowhere else in any species. So here's the story. I believe it's autumn. Each autumn, there is a huge migration of mullet fish that swim around where these dolphin populations are. And mullet are big fish, and dolphins and humans love to eat them. Okay. And when I say a huge migration, millions and millions of these mullet come through a certain time of the year. They pass where these dolphin populations are. We want them as food, and the dolphins want them as food. But each one of us has a different problem. The problem for the dolphins is that the mullet are large enough and nimble enough that they're not all that easy for dolphins to catch. The problem for the networks of Brazilian fishermen who specialize on these mullet migrations and whose very subsistence depends on it, their problem is that the water is murky and muddy, and they can't see the mullet very well. If they could, what they do is they throw these giant nets they have out and they pull them in. So there are these wonderful pictures of literally like a line of 50 of these fishermen with their nets ready to toss them if they can see where the mullet are. But it's murky and it's muddy. But that's not a problem for dolphins, because dolphins can use what's known as echolocation. Bats do this too. They basically send off sonar signals that bounce back to them and tell them where the fish are. So it doesn't matter if it's muddy and murky. The dolphins can find the mullet. Okay, so what the dolphins do when they find the mullet is they signal to the fishermen, the mullet are over here. And the way they do that is they have this very ritualized behavior that the fishermen know inside and out. If a dolphin's doing this, that means there are mullet here. What the dolphin does is it raises up a little bit out of the water, it arches its back, and most of the time it slaps its tail on the water. And it only does that when mullet are there and when fishermen are there. Then what the fishermen do is they throw out their nets, they pull in huge amounts of mullet. This causes chaos in the mullet world, and that chaos essentially allows the dolphins to go in and get them, because there's such commotion when all of these nets are being thrown that the mullet aren't doing what mullet normally do. And the dolphins can basically sit there and mullet almost swim into their mouth because they're just trying to get the hell away from the nets. And so everybody wins. The dolphins get their meals, the fishermen get their meals. So there's this remarkable interspecies cooperation going on. Now, the social networks. So Paulo and other people began to ask, what they saw was that many dolphins do this signaling behavior, but many don't. And the fishermen would tell them, that's a good dolphin. The fishermen know who the dolphins are individually, because in any given place, there might be a couple of dozen. They know them individually. They will tell Paulo, that's a good dolphin. He'll signal us. That's a bad dolphin. He won't. So there are signalers and there are non-signalers. And what Paulo wanted to know and his team wanted to know was, do the good signalers form a social network? And do the dolphins who don't signal, do they form a different social network? And so they began to ask that question. And what they found was that all year round, so not just this period of, I guess it's probably 3 or 4 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks where the mullet are migrating through, but all year round, there are very distinct social networks of dolphins that swim around together. They found 3 of those networks. And each one of them was interesting in its own right. Even when the mullet aren't around, and when they are, one network was made up completely of those dolphins that signal fishermen. Even if they're not signaling them 11 months out of the year, those dolphins are still hanging out together and forming a social network. There's another network, none of those dolphins signal the fishermen. And again, they're hanging out all year round. They're not as tightly connected as the network full of signalers, but they're still a real network. And then there's a third network, a third group of dolphins. And this one, in many ways, is the most interesting because it's the most unexpected. In this third network, every single dolphin except one doesn't signal. And there's this one signaler that hangs out with that group. What's fascinating is that if you look at that group, it's that signaler, the one individual who does, that actually has the most interaction with any other of the networks, particularly the network full of signalers. It's not in that network. It's hanging out with non-signalers, but it has some interaction with them more than anyone else does. And so Paulo and his team refer to that dolphin as a social broker. They're that bridge between one network that's totally made up of non-signalers, except for our network, for our broker, and another network that's made up of all signalers. It'll be incredible over time to see what happens. Does that bridge, does that broker dolphin somehow change the behavior of all the other dolphins in its network who don't signal? Do they begin to signal more? We don't know the answer yet, but that's the kind of thing you can ask.
These are the stories that make this such an incredible book.
This is crazy incredible.
Lee, you have done such a masterful job at finding two things, finding these incredible colleagues, and I'm so thrilled that you're talking about younger generation of scientists who are doing remarkable work, groundbreaking work, and you've just been masterful at finding these incredible examples and pulling them all together throughout this book. I'm going to ask you to maybe wrap up with one topic and maybe treat it lightly, because I really hope people will find the book, because I think we've talked about 3 or 4 examples, and there are dozens in the book like this. It particularly interesting to me, and that's culture. And such a great topic, because for so long, every anthropology textbook told us that culture was unique to humans. We know with certainty that is not true now. Can you give us just a little taste of how you talk about culture and social networks in your book?
Sure, absolutely. There are a number of examples. 2 of my favorites deal with dolphins, but one of them deals with dolphins, but we just did dolphins, so let's do something else. And this is our closest evolutionary relative, chimpanzees. And
no, don't talk about chimpanzees.
Really,
I love chimpanzees.
Okay. I would feel like I'm robbing your listeners if I didn't give one example with chimpanzees.
I agree.
Okay, so in this case, it deals with a social network and culture that revolves around the oddest of things. Basically, people were studying chimpanzees in Uganda in the I'm blocking Kibale Forest.
Kibale Forest.
Okay, and
by the way, it's one of the greatest places in the world to go and see chimpanzees. I've been there twice, and literally, stunningly walked out in the middle of chimpanzees hunting colobus monkeys and got to see that myself. Wow. So don't want to redirect the conversation, but Kibale Forest, I'm so happy you're bringing it up. What an incredible place in Uganda to see chimpanzees.
No, right. It absolutely is. And they do everything that you might think you would see in chimpanzees, that is super complex behaviors like the hunting that you were talking about. But one day, one of the researchers who was there, and I have to say I'm blanking on her name, but it'll come back to me, was studying gestures that the chimpanzees make. That was her focus. But all of a sudden, she saw something that she had never seen before. The chimps like to drink, and there are all these kind of little water holes that emerge after a storm and so on. One day, the chimpanzees made what we would call a moss. One of the chimps made a moss sponge. That is, they took a bunch of moss, they clumped it together, they held it in their hand, they put it into one of the watering holes, and then they squeezed the water into their mouth, right? Which is a hell of a lot easier than trying to scoop it up with your hands and have it slip between your fingers. And nobody had ever seen this sort of thing with a moss sponge in these chimpanzees. So they started paying attention, and they thought, nobody's ever seen this. I'm going to watch them, and I'm going to videotape them every day to see what happens with this moss sponge. Because initially it was just one of the dominant males who the researcher named Nick, who did this. So they're taping every day. They're watching what happens. It turns out that basically the information on moss sponges begins to filter through a social network of chimpanzees by culture. And what I mean is, if somebody saw Nick using the sponge, then that individual might pick up how to use a sponge. Many people would watch Nick and not. But if you wanted to know the next monkey, the next chimpanzee in line, it would have been someone, and they demonstrate this on the videos, that watched Nick use a sponge. So Nick's doing this new thing, I'm going to do it. Then, if you want to know who's going to learn next, you look at the videotapes and, okay, who picked up the behavior next? You find that chimpanzee, and it turns out that you can see that they learned it, right, either from Nick or the chimp that learned it from Nick. And this kind of sequence went on for 7 or 8 different chimpanzees in their group. None of whom knew how to use a moss sponge until Nick somehow or another figured out how to do this. Then individuals watched him, and individuals watched the watchers, and individuals watched the watchers of the watchers. And this behavior spread through not through the entire group, but through 8 different chimpanzees. Many chimps watched and just didn't do it. Why? Who knows? But the fact that a significant number of them did is remarkable. By the way, Kate Hobater.
Yeah, Kat Hobater. I was gonna remind you, she's a good colleague.
Kate Hobater is the name of the wonderful researcher who did this work. I'm sorry, Kate, that I blanked on your name initially. But so she was able to build this social network based on the videotapes. And the network, basically, the information was spreading through culture. I see you do it, I do it. You see me do it, you do it. And though I should say there was one exception. And it wasn't, and this was sometimes the exception teaches you something new. Every chimp who eventually picked up this sponging behavior, every one of them had watched somebody else do it, except one chimpanzee. And Kate went through over and over the videotapes, and she saw that this chimp was doing it, but there was no evidence from the videotapes. And she basically had them taped anytime they might do this. There was no evidence that this chimp saw anybody do this. And it wasn't Nick who initially learned it. It was somebody else. So what happened? How did this chimp learn how to use a moss sponge if everybody else did it by watching? So when Kate was going through the videotapes, like for the upteenth time, she noticed something. And what she noticed was that this chimpanzee who hadn't seen anybody, she saw this chimp go over and pick up a used moss sponge that one of the other chimps had thrown onto the forest floor. And that alone, that artifact, right, like an archaeological artifact, was enough. That chimpanzee basically probably picked it up, squeezed it, saw what it was possible to do with it, and used it herself. So this was the one example where it wasn't culture directly that was going on, but it was an indirect culture, right? Because if culture hadn't made so many other chimpanzees learn this, you wouldn't have found that discarded artifact on the ground. So even there, it was culture.
Phenomenal.
Yes.
So we've gone from guppies to chimpanzees.
I love it. Talked about my dolphins. It's all been great. Just so informative. And I can't wait. And I apologize for not reading the book before we spoke, but I will definitely be reading it now. And the book is?
The Well-Connected Animal by Dr. Allen Dugatkin. And I do want to note, Dr. Dugatkin has more than one book out. You might want to pick up How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog. And the other is Power in the Wild. All of these from University of Chicago Press. Great books. Lee, you have just been an incredible storyteller, unbelievable scientist. What a great conversation. Just can't thank you enough. You have absolutely been worth my time, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely worth my time. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
You've been tremendous.
I appreciate that. I really enjoyed it. And it's always wonderful to have the chance to talk about social networks and animals. And so I appreciate you giving me the chance to do that.
And pick up the book, The Well-Connected Animal. You will love it. Thanks again, Lee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Okay, thank you. I hope that worked for you. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I hope you did.
Oh,
it
my
was
gosh,
really
Lee,
interesting.
you're
awesome.
Oh, such a great storyteller.
Yes.
Absolutely fantastic. Hey, Lee, here's what we'll do, of course, is we'll stay in touch. We do these at least a few weeks or a couple months ahead of time. We'll get this posted and give you some warning in advance. And then unless there's any reason you don't want us to, we'll use images of the book when we post it and advertise it with the cover of your book. How about that?
That sounds great. Absolutely. And if you, when it's time, tell me, and I reach a fair number of people on Facebook.
Absolutely.
I will definitely spread the word. And thank you. I really appreciate it.
So Lee, you'll hear from many of us, but most likely Chris, because he does all of our
hard work.
He does all the hard work. So he'll get that done for you. Lee, you've been the best. I look forward to staying in touch. Thank you so much.
I look forward to it as well.
Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Lee.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Worth Your Time with Dr. Rob Shumaker and Kristi Lee. If you like what you hear, please give a review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. Word of mouth is the best compliment. Thanks to our producers, Chris Spangle of Leaders and Legends, LLC. You can reach him at leadersandlegends.net. Also, thanks to Sophie Ritz. I'm Christopher Geisen. Thanks for joining us.